I've ranked the FNAF games based on my opinion twice. I've ranked the FNAF games based on the opinions of others. I've reviewed Help Wanted and Security Breach. I've even reviewed the FNAF console ports. And today, I'm going to be ranking the FNAF games based purely on horror. This list will be organized from least scary to scariest and will include FNAF 1 to 7 and 9. Help Wanted just simply cannot be on this list because there's no real way to rank its horror in comparison to the others. It's inherently scary because it's a VR game, but in flat mode, it's not scary in the slightest. It can be played in two formats, and they alter the horror so much that there just isn't a way to rank it on this list. Check out my full video on Help Wanted if you want more specifics into what I mean by this, because there's a whole subject on the horror of this game. So this will be a ranking of Five Nights at Freddy's 1 to 4, Sister Location, Pizzeria Simulator, Ultimate Custom Night, and then the fresh Security Breach, all based on horror. Also, quick shout out to Shade Puppet for inspiring me to make this video. Here's Security Breach at the bottom, just like you expected. I just did my complete review of Security Breach, and what I said was that although the visuals are generally fantastic, there's absolutely nothing scary about this entire game. There are some jump scares that I could describe as startling, but they are either predictable or goofy. And there's nothing about the atmosphere or sound design that's remotely scary. It's really bright and colorful, and it's pretty clear to me that making this a horror game was not a priority by anybody working on this game. Security Breach just doesn't really feature a single element of game design that I'd expect from a horror game. The atmosphere, ambiance, music, sound design, visuals, jump scares are all not scary. Close to the very bottom, I feel the need to put Ultimate Custom Night. I've never really even viewed Ultimate Custom Night as a horror game. I've always seen it as a strategy game, and that's it. Because it's so focused on the mechanics, and your mind is so focused on managing everything going on, as opposed to elements like atmosphere. It's also just a combination of everything that had already been in the series, so nothing really caught me off guard even back in 2018. It was certainly original in some ways, but there was very little surprise factor in this game. There's also a lot of, the goofy voice lines, and of course the anime cutscenes, so it's not exactly easy to take this game seriously overall. The only thing that puts this one above Security Breach is the sound design. There's absolutely nothing amazing about it, but the ambiance is at least a little unsettling when you compare it to Security Breach. I guess the jump scares are also slightly scarier sometimes, but that's about all I can give it. There's just nothing about this game that I find scary because even the elements that I would consider horror-based just don't stand out. Yep, here it is, Five Nights at Freddy's 3. I've said many times that I see this as one of the weaker entries in the Five Nights series. In fact, I could argue it's the weakest in the series. And the horror in this game is not safe from the criticism. There's some decent sound design and decent jump scares, but it's more ugly than it is scary. I think Phantom Chica and Phantom Foxy have pretty solid jump scares, and the sound that Phantom Mangle triggers is pretty startling. You could also probably say the same thing about Phantom Puppet, but I don't know, for some reason I just find my Phantom Mangles much more jarring. And that's all I can think of. This game just looks so gross, and the cameras look so shitty, and there's nothing about the atmosphere that's scary. But hey, FNAF 3 beat out 2 games. That's the greatest achievement I'll probably ever give it on this channel. Although Five Nights at Freddy's 2 is my #1 in the entire series, I can't deny that it is nowhere near the scariest in the series. In fact, I would say the atmosphere and sound design is about as high quality as FNAF 3. The game isn't as ugly to look at, but there's really nothing scary about the atmosphere or sounds. However, the jump scares are executed much better. The tension for the jump scares builds pretty well, and the big difference between FNAF 2 and FNAF 3 is that FNAF 2 is fast-paced. Since FNAF 2 is much more fast-paced and the jump scares are done, better, they are pretty damn scary. I've been playing this game for 7 years, so I don't find it scary anymore, but I think looking at this series from an objective view, the jump scares in FNAF 2 are pretty good. Besides that, I think FNAF 2 is pretty underwhelming in the horror department. That's really the only thing I don't like about this game, except for maybe a few minor details. In fact, every game we've talked about this far, I would truly and honestly describe as not scary, but now we're getting into the more unsettling entries of the FNAF series. Although Sister Location isn't generally scary, I would say it features some of the scariest moments of the series. To get a little more specific, I think Sister Location features some of the best jump scares of the series. Bellora's in particular is pretty fantastic. I could go on and on about how the models and animations in this game are amazing, but focusing on the actual horror of this jump scare, it's done perfectly through both the sound and visuals. The sound is so startling in this really quiet space, and the opening of the faceplates just makes it even more terrifying. Funtime Freddy's jump scare, although I don't think it's quite as good, is also great for the same reasons. There's also the opening to Night 4 where Ballora gets fucking destroyed. This is also, of course, the first FNAF game with voice acting, and the developer definitely used that to push the horror a little bit. The way Baby speaks to you throughout the game is definitely not always scary, but it can certainly be unsettling a lot of the time. There's also the ending where Michael gets scooped, and this is another example of timing and sound design being used to execute a pretty horrific moment. Although Sister Location doesn't generally have a scary atmosphere or anything like that, but it features a lot of moments that I would consider some of the scariest in this franchise to date. I've never really known how to judge the horror in Pizzeria Simulator because the game's style changes pretty often. Is the Tycoon game scary? Nah. But is the Office portion of the game that fits the general FNAF formula scary? It's higher up there in the series, in my opinion. The gameplay of this game is genius in terms of utilizing sound design in horror. You need to listen attentively to be able to notice the slight sounds that the animatronics cause, because there's constant white noise that makes it harder to notice. So this builds tension, and that alone is pretty scary, but what this causes is the perfect effect for jump scares. The constant white noise forces you to listen closely, and when you get a jump scare in that moment, it's straight up panic-inducing. And I've said this plenty of times, I personally think that Pizzeria Simulator has the best jump scare sound effect. So although the models and animations of this game aren't the best the series has to offer, the tension building and sound designs are done so well that I personally believe this to be one of the scarier games of the series. As many have said before me, the first FNAF was just such a great combination of wonderful game elements that made for a great horror experience. The atmosphere of the first game hasn't really been imitated by anything else to this day. The combination of white noise, creepy music, walking sounds, groaning sounds, glitchy sounds, there's just so many pieces of sound design that make this game terrifying. It has great atmosphere and sound design, and what this game does better than any other in the series is present itself in a realistic style. The cameras aren't too low quality to be bad, nor are they too unrealistic to be taken seriously. They give you the perfect amount of clarity to make it feel real. The models, although not as high quality as the newer ones, are the closest the official series has come to realistic animatronics. They look like actual animatronics and costumes that you could see in the 80s and 90s, not only from a design perspective, but from a graphical perspective, to be totally honest. This game feels the most realistic and utilizes visuals and sounds excellently to make this experience pretty terrifying. I will say the jump scares aren't as good as a lot of the new ones, but I actually wouldn't say they're bad. Although if you compare the animations of the original game to that of Sister Location, they aren't as impressive. But FNAF 2, 3, 6, and 7 all feature still images as their jump scares. Technically, FNAF 3 has some animated jump scares, but I honestly don't think most of them even count. So they haven't actually even aged that badly. The first Five Nights at Freddy's is a great game and a great horror game. It's one of the scariest in the entire franchise, but it is topped only by Five Nights at Freddy's 4. Some might argue that this is a cheap shot at the number one, and I think this could actually be deemed a controversial pick, but let me explain why this game's horror goes strong beyond the jump scares. However, to get it out of the way, let's take a look at these jump scares and models, because of course they stand out. These models are so incredibly detailed and have such horrifying designs. The teeth, the claws, the tears all look so disturbing, and I genuinely think they're amazing overall. Their animations in their jump scares are also great, but let me talk about why the jump scares work so well. It's practically the same reason as in FNAF 6, except I think its execution is even scarier. You need to listen so closely, and you need to act constantly no matter what. In FNAF 6, you need to listen at all times because something theoretically could happen and you need to do something if something happens, but in FNAF 4, you need to act constantly, and if you don't act correctly, you get a terrifying jump scare. FNAF 6 has a lot of moments where you can sit down and focus on the noise for a minute, but in FNAF 4, nah bitch, you gotta act immediately, and if you don't, too bad. Now let's talk about the ambiance, because I personally think it's amazing. Boiling down FNAF 4's horror to the jump scares is unfair to me because the overall atmosphere gives off a very unsettling feeling. You could argue its atmosphere isn't as good or significant as FNAF 1's, but I still think it's great, and it's also on the more realistic end of FNAF games. Again, maybe not quite as much as FNAF 1, but I think the room is great graphically and the sound design really stands out. I just think the atmosphere in this entry is underrated because of how much the models stand out. This game is also, in my opinion, the only FNAF game that has scary mini-games with no jump scares. You could technically argue that FNAF 2 is scary mini-games because they end with jump scares, but the mini-games themselves, although good, are not generally scary. You could technically argue that FNAF 3 has scary minigames because they have some occasional startling sound effects, but the minigames themselves, although amazing from a story perspective, are not scary. FNAF 4's minigames are definitely scary by themselves. FNAF 4's minigames all feature an ambiance that is so unsettling and fantastic that I actually use it in videos from time to time. It really sets the tone for the entire game and makes the minigames feel like a complete horror experience despite not having any other sounds. Yes, the older brother has some jump scares in these minigames, and yeah, like in FNAF 3, that's a cheap shot at horror, but I don't think it actually even stands out because I think it just blends in with the game very well. And again, I think the minigames have plenty of other elements that make it scary. And although FNAF 3's minigames are great from a story perspective, I think the stories of FNAF 4's minigames are legitimately scary relative to all the others. The way the torture of this child evolves over time and the terrifying conclusion of the post-Night 5 and post-Night 6 minigame just provides an amazing scary and emotional experience. Between FNAF 1 and FNAF 4, I think there's an argument to be had, and I did find it difficult deciding on which one to choose as the top spot, but I think the elements of horror are just more consistent and thorough in Five Nights at Freddy's 4. So that's the end of this video. Let me know what you think is the scariest FNAF game in the comments. And let me know what you thought of my picks. I've talked about the entire line of FNAF games so many times, and it was nice to be able to focus on a single element of their game design, so let me know if you have any ideas for other videos, similar or otherwise, that you think I should do. I hope you all enjoyed. Please hit like and subscribe if you did, it helps out more than you know, and I'll see you guys in the next video.